I first heard that our summer sermon series was going to be I Love to Tell the Story, and that we would be preaching on our favorite Bible passages, my brain began moving in about a million directions. Some of the stories I thought of had already been claimed for other Sundays. Others were stories that we've heard somewhat recently in last summer's That's Weird series. And as I continued brainstorming, I came across a quote from a favorite novel, and I thought, why can't I just preach on that? Before deciding that I would make my decision later. Well, later came and went, and I couldn't get that quote out of my mind. As I continued to sit with it, I realized just how many biblical stories that the line could have been used to describe, including the one that we just heard a moment ago. And since we can learn about our faith from all types of stories, I'm going to read an excerpt from C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. This specifically is from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which, depending on how you prefer to order them, is either the first or second book in the series. And it is from chapter 8, which is called What Happened After Dinner. "Tell us about Aslan," said several voices at once. For once again, that strange feeling, like the first signs of spring, like good news, had come over them. "Who is Aslan?" asked Susan. "Aslan," said Mr. Beaver. "Why, don't you know? He's the king. He's the lord of the whole wood. But not often here, you understand. Never in my time or my father's time. But word has reached us that he has come back. He is in Narnia at this moment. He'll put all to rights, as it says in an old rhyme in these parts. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death, and when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. You'll understand when you see him." "But shall we see him?" asked Susan. "Why, daughter of Eve, that's what I brought you here for. I'm to lead you where you shall meet him," said Mr. Beaver. Is he a man?" asked Lucy. "Aslan, a man?" said Mr. Beaver sternly. "Certainly not. I tell you he's the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion." "Oh," said Susan, "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "That you will, dearie, make no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly." "Then he isn't safe," said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." "I'm longing to see him," said Peter, "even if I do feel frightened when it comes to the point." "Course he isn't safe, but he's good." It jumped out at me and has been sitting in my brain for a couple of weeks now. It's a reminder that we need to hear from time to time. In speaking and writing about the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis confirms that, yes, Aslan is an allegory for Jesus. And as our passage this morning shows us, putting our trust in Jesus, following in Jesus' footsteps, isn't always going to be safe, but it is certainly good. Whether you read the story of Jesus and Peter walking on the water as a literal event that happened, or as some scholars believe, as a metaphor for the church when Matthew's gospel was written, and if we're being honest, a metaphor for the church throughout much of time, the danger is clear in the passage. It's a stormy night, and the disciples, many of whom were seasoned fishermen, are stuck in the storm-tossed waters. When Matthew was writing, the church was wrestling with conflict both from within and from the outside, something that was not unique to that time period. Despite the dangers that the storm and waves create, Peter trusts in Jesus and takes a few faltering but extremely significant steps out onto the water in his attempt to emulate Jesus, in his attempt to be like Jesus. It's only when Peter's fear overtakes his trust and faith that he begins to sink. And what does Jesus do? Does he dust off his hands and say, "Oh, well, I thought he was going to be a good one, but guess I was wrong"? No, Jesus reaches out. He pulls Peter from the water. Peter steps out in faith and in faithfulness, and Jesus doesn't leave him to sink. Jesus asks the same of us. We are often called into uncharted or troubled waters, and when we go in faithfulness, Jesus will never abandon us. If we are to live lives of faithfulness and live into the call of Christ, we need to step out in faith, even onto troubled waters. Like the biblical Peter who steps onto the water, or the Peter in Narnia who says of Aslan, "I'm longing to see him, even if I do feel frightened when it comes to the point," we will feel afraid. Following God's call and stepping out in faith are scary prospects. Being a disciple is risky business, but it is our calling and one that we do not live alone. Fear is the central emotion, the recurring theme in this passage. The phrases terrified, cried in fear, do not be afraid, and became frightened, all occur in just 11 verses. It's as if the author of Matthew is begging us not to overlook this emotion. Peter is able to push through his fear for a few moments, and it is transformational. Not just for Peter, who walks out onto the water, but for all of the other disciples as well. For the other 11, Peter's act of faith, his taking a risk, his trusting in his Lord, and his stepping out of the boat and onto the water, turns their fear into worship. The trust and risk of one follower has an effect on the whole community of followers on that stormy night. And when we risk boldly and move toward the call of Jesus, despite our fear and trepidation, we too can make a difference in the lives of others. How is Christ calling out to you? We live in a troubled world. In our country alone, we see protests and counter-protests, some peaceful, others not so much. We experience gun violence and mass shootings. We value being correct over being connectional. It's a world where instead of listening and trying to understand those who are different from us, especially those from marginalized or historically oppressed communities, the goal is to talk the loudest and talk the longest so that we can pretend that their plight, their stories, their agency, perhaps even their personhood doesn't matter or doesn't exist. How is Christ calling to you? Where is Christ calling you to go? What is Christ calling you to do? If we listen, we might be amazed at what Christ can do with and through us when we step out in faith despite our fears. The world is a stormy place, but we are called to be like Peter, to set aside our fear even for just a moment and put our trust in Jesus. Step out of the boat. Perhaps you only make it a few steps, or maybe, just maybe, you'll surprise yourself as your faith takes you places that you never imagined. Truly following Christ, listening to his words, and living by his example will take us out of the safety of our homes, our church, our community, our town, and our comfort zone. Truly following Christ is not safe, but oh, is it good. Amen.